Thank you. Hi, everybody. And Merry Christmas. So the title of my talk is changed. If you have a handout, you'll notice that it doesn't correspond to the build title, which was Divine Art and Human Emotion. I've retitled this Beauty and Divine Emotion. Which is probably more catchy. I wish I thought of that earlier. But as I was writing this lecture/chapter for this book I'm working on, as Luke mentioned, it evolved. This is how it is, with writing things. It evolved. Probably far more than they do in the biological realm. And this evolved. And so this is entitled Beauty and Divine Emotion. So, in my previous talk, I presented a theological case for what I call the aesthetic interpretation of the world. That's the idea that the entire cosmos is a genuine work of art and that God is the divine artist. So I have since named this the Divine Art Paradigm, and it has a nice little three-letter catchy acronym, DAP. If I use the word DAP, we know that is abbreviating Divine Art Paradigm, or it could be the Divine Aesthetic Paradigm, the idea that the whole cosmos is an aesthetic phenomenon. It's a work of art. So in my last talk, I explored some of the implications of that idea, including the implications for education, among other things, and how we should organize the disciplines. Here I will further establish the conceptual foundation for the divine art paradigm by considering a number of philosophical grounds for this view, whereas the foundational theological justification for this thesis pertains to the nature of God. The philosophical basis concerns the nature of art and the world. For those just coming in, there's a handout back there on one of the chairs you want to grab. So that'll be the focus of this talk, as well as the two talks I'm going to give in the spring. One focusing on history as the divine drama, the divine human drama, and science, which is the study of God's tangible artwork, physical cosmos. Okay, so definitions of art. I hope, as I mentioned, what I did last time establishes good theological grounds for thinking that God is a genuine artist and that the world is God's artwork. However, an important question to consider to bolster this claim is whether this view is compatible with a generally reasonable understanding of the nature of art. Does the divine art paradigm cohere with our understanding of the nature of art? Throughout Western intellectual history, many theories of art have been proposed, and a recurrent theme among them is that it's an emphasis on human emotion, the power of art to evoke, communicate, and express emotion. So after reviewing some of these theories, I'm going to assess their compatibility with this divine art paradigm. And we'll see that by any of these definitions of art, the world may be conceived as a genuine artwork. Moreover, the insights of each theory helpfully inform and enrich the concept of God as an artist, particularly in light of the power of art to express, evoke, communicate emotion. So, first major definition of art, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, is art as mimesis, the mimetic view. According to Plato and Aristotle and many of their contemporaries, the essence of art is imitative. Art properly aims to represent realities about the physical world and human life As Aristotle puts it, imitation is natural to man from childhood. He is the most imitative creature in the world. And it is also natural for all to delight in works of imitation, says Aristotle. According to him, epic, poetry, tragedy, comedy, and much music is imitative. Each has a particular means of imitation. However, and that would include music, which uses rhythm and harmony, dance, which uses rhythm alone, and poetry, which uses language. Regarding their object of imitation, the various arts differ in terms of whether they imitate natural objects or, say, people's actions. And regarding the manner of imitation, they differ in terms of their use of narrative, character portrayal, and so on. But creative imitation, says Aristotle, is natural to humankind. It constitutes one of our advantages over the animals. The ancient Greeks were especially good at the art form of drama, as the long list of great playwrights from that period demonstrates. Aristotle defined comedy as the dramatic imitation of people worse than average, and observed that it pertains to the ridiculous, species of the ugly. Tragedy, on the other hand, is a dramatic imitation of action, quote, arousing pity and fear wherewith to accomplish catharsis of such emotions. If the characters are compelling, the audience will empathize with them, identifying with their feelings. This creates the possibility of a cathartic purging or cleansing of such negative emotions. So, if we apply a Greek mimetic view of art to the view that the cosmos is a divine artwork, what are we to conclude? Does DAP make sense of this? Otherwise put, given a mimetic view of art, is it reasonable to suggest that the world is a divine artwork? I think so, on several grounds. Given the mimetic view, we may say that in creating, God is constantly imitating his own ideas, which, speaking platonically, we might call the eternal forms in the mind of God. It's quite a mystery how or why God has just the ideas that he has, or why he decides to instantiate the ideas he does in the form of concrete objects, such as mountains, trees, dogs, fish. This also readily applies to people, as the characters that God creates, including you and me, are also instantiations of a fundamental eternal essence. Though in this case, that essence actually bears the image of God himself. We humans can be rightly seen as a divine self-mimesis, instantiated tens of billions of times throughout the history of our planet. And as we live our lives, we partake in dramas that are both comical and tragic. All of us are, at once or by turns, dignified, ridiculous, honorable, repugnant, virtuous, and vicious. And the upward and downward permutations of our life stories make us laugh and cry as they do those who observe, whether that audience is our family, friends, angelic beings, or anyone else who learns of our stories. To the extent that our personal dramas arouse pity, fear, or other feelings, there occurs the sort of purging of emotions to which Aristotle refers. Okay, so that's the mimetic view, and how it can be seen from the standpoint of the divine art paradigm. Next, formalism. Another major aesthetic theory is formalism, which defines art and aesthetic properties in terms of formal structural properties. In the visual arts, such as painting and sculpture, these qualities include color, shape, composition, texture, and balance. In music, the formal qualities include pitch, timbre, tempo, rhythm, melody, harmony, and dynamics. So it goes for any art, or any art form. There are Christian precursors of this approach who might be regarded as proto-formalists, those who anticipated the formalist movement of the 20th century. For example, Augustine's philosophical theology of music, which focuses more on rhythm than melody, is highly mathematical. He argues rhythm is not a human convention, but originates from God and is therefore eternal. Like mathematical truth, rhythm is discovered by humans, it's not invented. In fact, since rhythm can be systematically measured and described numerically, and numbers are eternal and immutable, it follows that, as he puts it, rhythm is eternal and immutable. As for its aesthetic value, what is pleasurable about rhythm, according to Augustine, is its proportion and symmetry. This is what establishes its unity, and therefore its beauty. Aquinas shares Augustine's formalistic intuition here and extends it to an account of beauty generally, when he says beauty, quote, consists in due proportion, for the senses delight in things duly proportioned, as in what is after their own kind, because even sense is a sort of a reason, just as is every cognitive faculty, end quote. Aquinas remains vague on the precise ways in which beautiful objects achieve their pleasing proportions. A later proto-formalist, Edmund Burke, would attempt to explain this, insisting that, quote, beauty is some quality in bodies acting mechanically upon the human mind by the intervention of the senses. Essential qualities of the beautiful, according to Burke, include smoothness, as seen in streams, flowers, animal furs, ornamental furniture, and women's faces. Gradual variation, as opposed to angularity, as observed in the body parts of birds, and delicacy, as we see, for example, in flowers. So by the time we arrive at 20th century formalists like Clive Bell and Suzanne Langer, formalistic aesthetic theories already had a long history. Bell famously proposes that the essential feature of an art object is what he calls significant form, which he says denotes, quote, those relations and combinations of lines and colors, these aesthetically moving forms, end quote. This is the quality without which nothing is art, and possessing which no work is altogether worthless. Moreover, this is what explains the peculiar emotion that works of art evoke. Different emotions are produced by different artworks, but they are all of the same kind, he says. And this is the aesthetic emotion. So how might this apply to the divine artwork? Formalists typically insist that the aesthetic emotion is not evoked by objects in nature, but only by human-made artworks. And yet, there are features of the physical world that seem to consistently prompt aesthetic emotions among observers. I think most of us would report that. These include atmospheric phenomena such as rainbows, sunsets, supercell thunderstorms, and the aurora borealis, the vibrant blooms of peonies, orchids, hibiscus, and countless other floral species of plants, and the sublime beauty of the tiger, the wildly colorful emperor angelfish, and the bioluminescence of ocean microorganisms. While these and natural and living systems prompt aesthetic delight, there is also the category of the biological macabre, organisms whose appearance or way of life is creepy or even grotesque, yet somehow fascinating, such as the tarantula, the spider wasp, and the humpback anglerfish. If you are familiar with any of those organisms, you might get that kind of chill down your spine even thinking about these things. Another striking source of aesthetic delight is found in fractals, which are pervasive throughout nature. Fractals are complex patterns produced by the repetition of a simple formula. They produce self-similar structures across various scales and can be found in flowers, trees, seashells, lightning, hurricanes, and entire galaxies. In the human body, fractals are evident in the branching of brain neurons and lung alveoli, both of which bear a striking similarity to trees. The aesthetic appeal of fractal patterns is significant, as is evident in their deployment by artists across many cultures throughout human history. From the ancient Aztecs, Incans, Mayans, and Romans to contemporary African textiles, Celtic knotwork, and the artwork of M.C. Escher and Jackson Pollock. And contemporary digital art is a currently burgeoning field of fractals. Okay, so formalism. Next, the communication theory. Another major aesthetic theory insists that art essentially involves the communication of ideas or truths. An ancient example is Plotinus, who maintained that the work of the artist communicates eternal, intelligible forms, which are ultimately divine ideas. Even if the art object features a natural object, such as an animal or a landscape, the ultimate ideas it conveys are transcendent and eternal. The proper aim of the artist is not to imitate nature, but actually to transcend it. According to Plotinus, something is beautiful through its participation in something like a Platonic eternal idea. He says a body comes to be beautiful by its association with an express principle coming from the divine forms. On this view, then, the artist serves as a sort of conduit or means of transmission, as his or her art enables the soul to ascend to higher levels of contemplation and understanding. John Dewey advocated a more naturalistic version of the communication theory. He saw art as a form of evocative communication between human beings. The artist uses his or her medium to create an object that effectively produces a certain cognitive or emotional state in another person. For Dewey, works of art have a unique power since they, quote, are the only media of complete and unhindered communication between man and man, end quote. There is a significant social value in this, as art provides a real means of shared experiences which overcomes divisions between people, creating solidarity and fostering community. Art is not only a universal means of communication, but a powerful source of deep human unity. The communication theory works well with the divine art paradigm, as his perspective naturally invites us to see the cosmos as a communication of divine ideas. Theologians from Aquinas to Karl Rahner have emphasized this very point. Irish bishop and philosopher George Berkeley even proposed that the physical world is a sort of divine language. Just as words are composed of individual letters arranged in meaningful ways, physical objects are likewise composed of particular qualities that have a semantic dimension. For example, the word storm is a particular ordering of the letters S-T-O-R-M. These English letter universals, so arranged, convey a particular concept or idea. Similarly, in the physical world, a particular arrangement of dark gray hues in the sky, accompanied by rumbling sounds and perhaps sudden bursts of bright bluish light, also convey meaning. And we respond accordingly. The world is full of semantic content, enabling us to infer causes, make predictions, and solve problems, as well as devise effective ways of coping in the world. Not only this, but especially wise discernment of the divine language of nature enables us to gain moral wisdom from the various second meanings implicit in the cosmic artwork, important themes, values, and truthful insights which enlighten and inspire and motivate pursuit of the good. Scripture enjoins us to find and learn from such second meanings. For example, a proverb says, "Go to the ant, you sluggard, consider its ways and be wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler, yet it stores its provisions in summer and gathers its food in harvest." That's in Proverbs 6. Elsewhere we're told, "As a dog returns to its vomit, so fools repeat their folly." Proverbs 26. And of course, Jesus' teachings are replete with illustrations from nature, including sheep, wolves, serpents, doves, trees, vines, lilies, figs, rocks, weeds, wheat, seeds, rocks, and seasons of the year. Many of his parables leverage agricultural practices in detail, This is what we might expect from a teacher who is actually the one through whom nature was created. The moral lessons of nature came from him in the first place and have been there all along for us to benefit from. Jesus simply draws our attention to them. The cosmic artist communicates through his artwork, and it's our business to discern the meanings and put them into practice. Okay? So you could say maybe Jesus, he could be conceived as doing a kind of literary or otherwise artistic interpretation of the artwork that is his own, as the one through whom the whole of creation came to be. Okay, finally, the expressive theory. While many formalists and communication theorists recognize the power of art to transmit or evoke emotion, their focus is on the art object rather than the person experiencing the work. Proponents of the expressive theory maintain that the defining feature of genuine art is that it expresses the emotions of the artist. A major proponent of this view is the great Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy, who maintained that art essentially involves the transmission of emotions from the artist to the audience. As he puts it, quote, art is a human activity consisting in this, that one man consciously, by means of certain external signs, hands on to others feelings that he has lived through, and that others are infected by these feelings and also experiences them, end quote. Tolstoy adds, quote, not only is infection a sure sign of art, but the degree of infectiousness is also the sole measure of excellence in art. The stronger the infection, the better is the art, end quote. An influential 20th century advocate of this expressive theory is R.G. Collingwood. He similarly understood the purpose of art to be the expression and arousal of emotion. The object of the artist, he says, is quote, to discover emotions in himself of which he was unaware, and by permitting the audience to witness that discovery, enable them to make a similar discovery about themselves. End quote. Thus, for Collingwood, the artistic process involves a certain emotional self-discovery on the part of the artist, as much as it involves the conveyance of those emotions to the audience. And the mark of a particularly effective artist is the lucidity and intelligibility of her artwork. Just as the artist's creative expression makes her emotions intelligible to herself, she also makes them intelligible to the person experiencing the artwork. So how might the divine art paradigm fit with the expressive theory? A natural and easy response here would be simply to say that yes, the cosmos is the creative expression of divine emotion. The problem, however, is that the whole concept of divine emotion is highly controversial in the history of Christian theology. So we will need to carefully consider our prospects in applying the divine art paradigm to the expressive theory of art, as well as other theories, to the extent that they apply the reality of divine emotions. So I'm going to wade into these dangerous waters. Okay. A recurrent theme among aesthetic theories, including several of those just discussed, is that art has something significant to do with emotions, whether to purge, evoke, communicate, or express emotive states. So, what implications might this have for conceiving of the world as an artwork and regarding God as a genuine artist? It's empirically obvious that people are often emotionally moved by various aspects of creation, from flowers and animals to sunsets and astronomical phenomena. In this sense, it seems clear that the divine artwork does evoke human emotion. But is it appropriate to say that creation is also an expression or communication of God's emotion? That's the question. This raises the question whether, in fact, God has emotions. There's been a centuries-long debate over this question, featuring two main positions on the issue. On the one hand, divine Impassibilists claim that God does not have emotions, such as anger, sadness, or even pleasure. And biblical references to divine expressions of emotion are merely anthropomorphic, or to be more precise, it's an ugly word, but it's the more exact term, anthropopathic. Right? They're just kind of expressions that are intended to kind of provide an image, based on human experience that really doesn't apply to God. In contrast, divine passibilists insist that such references ought to be taken more or less literally, and that God does have genuine emotions. So both sides of this debate warrant serious consideration. And they have arguments, and so I'll summarize a few of these on each side. Divine impassibilists have argued that emotions are inconsistent with divine eternality and immutability. For example, Thomas Aquinas appeals to the fact that, quote, God is without beginning and end, having his whole being at once, end quote. And, quote, God's understanding has no succession, as neither does his being. He is therefore an ever-abiding, simultaneous whole, end quote. That's Aquinas. Consequently, according to Aquinas, God cannot have real emotions, since this would seem to imply temporality and thus change. Others argue that emotions are inconsistent with divine moral perfection. Thus, Paul Helm says, quote, one clear reason for not ascribing emotion or passion to God is that it's incompatible with his rationality and wisdom. To act upon emotion or passion is to act when the judgment is in abeyance. Emotion clouds judgment or functions in place of the judgment, end quote. That's Helm. Impassibilists do not restrict their arguments to a priori consideration of the divine nature, though this is their preferred approach. They also use scriptural arguments to support their commitment to divine immutability and atemporality, in insisting that God has no real emotions. In Malachi 3:6 we read, I, the Lord, do not change. And James 1:17 says, God does not change like shifting shadows. Impassibilists insist that such passages indicate that God cannot experience emotions. Again, assuming that emotion involves change. That's a critical assumption. Divine passibilists have their arguments as well, including a basic appeal to divine personhood, which they maintain requires emotional capacities. Some insist that an emotionless God is also bereft of love. Thus, Jürgen Moltmann argues that an impassible God cannot be moved by suffering and injustice. And, quote, because he is so completely insensitive, he cannot be affected or shaken by anything. He cannot weep. He has no tears. But the one who cannot suffer cannot love either. So he is also a loveless being, end quote. That's Moltmann. This also has implications for divine knowledge, according to some impassibilists. After all, some truths cannot be known in a purely propositional way, but must be known experientially, such as what it is like to be slandered or betrayed. So if God is to truly know these sorrows, he must experience them. Many passibilists leverage Christology to make this point. It's Paul Fidei, who says, if theology affirms that in any sense God was in Christ, then it seems an inescapable conclusion that God suffered in Christ at the cross. If God was involved with the person and career of Jesus, then he was implicated in the experience of the crucified Christ. End quote. Finally, like impassibilists, divine passibilists deploy scriptural arguments in defense of their view, appealing to numerous passages referencing divine emotions, such as Genesis 6:6, which attributes grief and sorrow to God as he observes the wickedness rampant on the earth. Or other passages which ascribe to God a range of emotions, including regret in 1 Samuel 15, anger in Exodus, and all over the place, actually, the Psalms and so on. Love, right? That's all over the place in Scripture. divine hatred, and surprise even in Genesis 22, and humor, and a whole array of other emotions that are ascribed to God. Passibilists said, come on, are we going to take that seriously or not? Okay, so divine passibilists and impassibilists alike appear to have strong arguments to recommend their positions. Which view is correct? It might seem that we must first establish a winner in this debate before we decide whether expressivism or any other emotion-oriented aesthetic theory can be appropriately applied to the notion that God is a cosmic artist. That's why we're doing this. But what if this debate constitutes a false dilemma? What if there's a third alternative that embraces each of the basic claims made by the standard views? It seems to me that all of the arguments above, on both sides, appeal to attributes of God that must be affirmed in order to preserve a philosophically, theologically, and existentially adequate theism, or view of God. Therefore, I want to explore the possibility of developing a perspective that affirms the impassibilist intuitions regarding divine immutability and omniscience. And I want to affirm the immutability and timeless eternity, as well as the passibilist intuitions about divine personhood and omniscience. And I want to affirm the sensibilities on both sides regarding Scripture. Right? I want the best of both worlds here. Is a reasonable compromise between these conflicting views possible? I think so. And to see what such a view amounts to, we need only apply some ingenuity in combining the attributes emphasized above. Let us grant the essence of divine passibilism, that God experiences real emotions. The Lord really feels sorrow, joy, anger, humor, grief, pain, affection, and so on. But let us also concede the impassibilist point that God is both immutable and timelessly eternal. Keeping in mind that this claim implies that the divine life is lived, as it were, all at once. Aquinas is right there. As unfathomable as that is to our finite mind. As Aquinas notes, something can be present to what is eternal only by being present to the whole of it, since the eternal does not have the duration of succession, end quote. Taking these 2 points together, we arrive at the notion that God experiences all of his emotions at once. I lost my place. That is, eternally. If God is immutable and the inner life of God is one of absolute simultaneity, everything all at once, then if God has any feelings whatsoever, they must be eternal. So on this view, like God's knowledge, divine feelings are ever constant and unchanging. He experiences all emotions and does so for all eternity. God, we might say, is omnipathic. What I'm proposing here is a possibility that both sides of this debate are correct, at least as regards their positive claims about God, about God's nature. That is, that God is immutable and timelessly eternal on the one hand, and that God is personal and experientially omniscient on the other. I am, of course, implying that both sides have been mistaken as well, specifically in their negative claims that God's immutability and timeless eternality and God's personhood and experiential omniscience are mutually exclusive. From a theoretical standpoint, the advantage of proposing a mediating position like this is that I can simply appeal to arguments on both sides of the debate as favoring my position. The disadvantage is that each theory is naturally to be questioned for its coherence. Can this view really incorporate the insights on either side of the conceptual divide and at the same time avoid internal contradiction? This is not something that can be proven with a few cogent arguments. It can only be shown by developing the model. In this case, by unpacking the concept of omnipathos. Therefore, my method will be essentially abductive making the case for this theory based on its overall explanatory power. I'll proceed by showing how divine omnipathos compares to and complements some other classic divine attributes. These will serve as a sort of conceptual guide, steering our intuitions about divine omnipathos in one direction or another. Hopefully this will enable us to see divine omnipathos as fitting comfortably with these other divine attributes and more broadly with an orthodox account of the divine nature. I'll also illustrate other virtues of the theory, both theoretical and practical in nature. My hope is that this will effectively demonstrate that divine omnipathism is a reasonable alternative to the two standard views. If so, then this will show that the expressivist view of art is, at least in principle, compatible with the divine art paradigm. Okay, omniscience. I have chosen the term omnipathic to describe God in the context of divine emotion. Not only because it is an accurate description of the view I'm proposing, but also because it's intended to make the doctrine of divine omnipathos parallel some other divine attributes. Just how close those parallels are, however, will possibly be a contentious matter depending upon one's views of the other divine attributes. Let us begin with the doctrine of divine knowledge. Consider the definition of omniscience as the knowledge of all true propositions. In formalizing our understanding of omnipathos, we may begin by defining the concept in a way that is strictly parallel to the understanding of divine knowledge, such that omnipathos is the actual experience of all emotions. Emotions are arguably a kind of awareness. Some have even argued that emotions are a means of acquiring knowledge or accessing truth. In any case, if to have an emotion is to be aware in some special way, or if emotion in any way involves awareness, then this seems to make emotion quite similar to knowledge. After all, knowledge is or involves a certain kind of awareness. Or to make the case more cautiously, emotion has or involves an essentially cognitive component, as does knowledge. So if it's reasonable to suppose that God knows all true propositions and does so immutably and timelessly, then why not also suppose that God similarly has complete emotive awareness immutably and timelessly? This raises a question, however. Given the concept of divine omnipathos, are we to suppose that this involves the experience of all real emotions in this world, or the experience of all emotions in all possible worlds? The issue then is whether or not God's emotions are analogous to his knowledge of just this actual world, or his knowledge of all the worlds that God can imagine. Many philosophers affirm that in addition to knowing everything there is to know about the actual world, God knows all that would obtain in every possible world. So for the omnipathicist, the question is whether God's emotional life is similarly transworldly in that sense. Does God only experience all emotions actually experienced by creatures in this world, or does he also experience all logically possible emotion? That is, all emotions that could be experienced by creatures in all possible worlds. This is an interesting question, to be sure, but not one that we need to settle here. Just as believers in divine omniscience may reasonably disagree about the modal scope of God's knowledge, that is, his knowledge of what could or could not be, proponents of divine omnipathos may engage in a reasonably parallel debate about the modal scope of God's emotional awareness. But I believe that we can at least say that when paralleled by an orthodox concept of omniscience, divine omnipathos would at least involve experiential awareness of all actual emotions. And now omnipresence. What does it mean to say that God is omnipresent? Since God is not an essentially embodied being, any plausible account of the concept will have to involve divine mental attributes. Accordingly, I would propose that the concept be unpacked in terms of awareness. For a spirit, that is a non-physical conscious substance, To be omnipresent entails that that being is aware of the physical cosmos from every spatially locatable perspective. That is, every point of view that someone could have within the cosmos, an omnipresent spirit in fact has. One might say then that an omnipresent being is omniperspectival. Thus, we may say that omnipresence is the possession of every spatially locatable perspective. Any perspective one could have on the whole universe, even at the very center of the planet Jupiter, right? God has that perspective. Now, just as divine omnipresence entails that God's experience exhausts all cosmic points of view, we might say that divine omnipathos entails that God's experience exhausts the whole range of emotions. God is, on this model, emotively complete. Just as there are no novel spatial perspectives that may be added to the divine perspective to improve God's perception of the cosmos, so there are no new emotions God can experience to increase his awareness of creaturely feelings. To apply this to a concrete case, suppose Jane suffers a grief of some kind, like the loss of a loved one. On the omnipathic view, God knows in the deepest existential sense just what Jane experiences. God not only knows her point of view on the world spatially, but God also shares her emotive perspective. Now, to faithfully model omnipathos on our definition of omnipresence, we must affirm that God is not merely empathetic in the sense that he feels some pain much like Jane's, but rather God feels this pain of hers. Notice how this parallel between omnipathos and omnipresence entails that God experiences all emotion tokens as opposed to mere emotion types. That is, an omnipathic God experiences not just all kinds of emotions, but all particular instances of each kind of emotion. Given the classical doctrine of omnipresence, it's curious that only relatively recently have theists pressed the point that God is passible. If one supposes that God looks out on the world from every perspective, then it seems natural to suppose that God should also feel, as it were, from every emotive perspective. Here, the passibilist argument from omniscience is applicable. If God really knows all truths, then God must know what it is like to experience a particular emotion wherever and however that emotion is felt. Jane's sorrow about her lost loved one is a fact about the world, and how it feels to actually experience that sorrow is a significant aspect of that emotive fact. So it seems that God must not only be aware of the sorrow Jane is experiencing, God must be aware of what it is like to actually experience Jane's sorrow. So, based on our reflections on divine omniscience and omnipresence, we may summarize our understanding of divine omnipathism as the view that God has all emotions eternally and unchangeably. The view has direct parallels to the doctrines of divine omniscience and omnipresence. Omnipathism is analogous to the former in affirming exhaustive divine knowledge of all emotions. Otherwise put, God has direct existential acquaintance with all emotional states, whether understood as divine experiential awareness of all actual particular emotions or all possible emotions. Omnipathism is analogous to omnipresence in affirming that God possesses every emotional perspective or point of view. God's experiential perspective is emotively complete, not lacking any existential awareness of any particular person's emotive states, whether actual or possible, again. But this awareness in no way implies divine mutability, limitation, or imperfection. In fact, the full panoply of emotive states in the divine mind is simply another inexhaustible dimension of his infinite, eternal being. And it's precisely because these emotive states are aspects of that infinite consciousness that we need not worry about omnipathism undermining the absolute abiding joy of God. And now some practical benefits. While this discussion might seem remote or abstract, it's actually highly practical In fact, ironically, it shows that God is not emotionally remote, that his empathetic feelings are concretely real, not abstract. If God is omnipathic in the ways just described, then his knowledge of our sorrows and joys is not merely propositional, such that God only knows that Jane is sad. Rather, he feels Jane's sorrow with her, and in the fullest emotive sense. God has existential awareness of the whole spectrum of her grief states, including feelings of hopelessness, anger, and exhaustion. Though unlike us, he is not dominated by any of those emotions, which is what makes it so unpleasant, right? But as human beings, we're finite, so we get dominated by a sadness or sorrow or grief. God is infinitely great. There's no way he can be dominated by any emotion, any negative emotion. That's why it's my view that his prevailing emotion is joy. We got arguments for that, but moving on. So this is that God's prevailing emotion is joy is an encouraging idea that points toward the eschaton, where all of our pain and suffering will be swallowed up in everlasting joy. That would be part of, I suppose, I speculate, but maybe with good reason, I think with good reason, that final stage for us as human beings called glorification will involve that sort of that dominance of joy that somehow mirrors the dominance of joy in God. So another practical benefit of divine omnipathos is how it helps with prayer, whether for ourselves or for others, in all categories, including praise, thanksgiving, confession, and petitionary prayer. When we praise God in exuberant joy, we can know that God not only has propositional knowledge of that positive action, but he also feels our joy. Likewise, God feels our gratitude when we give thanks. He feels our sadness and regret when we confess our sins. And he feels our earnestness and desperation when we bring our supplications before him. As with every other life context, we can be confident our omnipathic God feels all of our prayerful emotions rather than merely knowing that we have these emotions. Confidence in divine omnipathos also helps us as friends, counselors, and therapists, as we can encourage those who suffer with the fact that God genuinely empathizes with their plight. Right? And empathy is not just anthropopathism. Whatever feelings they may be enduring, God has full experiential affinity with them. This fact also serves to legitimize one's emotions, reinforcing the fact that they are not an unfortunate consequence of our fallenness, and thus something to be repented of, but an aspect of our being that is divinely purposed. Okay? God made us to be emotional. Not only this, they are grounded in the being of God. Our emotions are aspects of the imago Dei. Right? The impassibles can't make sense of that. They can't go there. This frees us to feel deeply and to communicate and evoke emotions in others, even through our deepest distress. Here we realize that not only did Jesus weep for his lost friend Lazarus, he weeps with all of us in all of our losses. Finally, as an artist, I am free and even encouraged to express and evoke emotion in my music, painting, drama, or whatever other artwork I create. As bearers of the image of God, our artistry mirrors the divine artistry, not only in its striving for beauty, but in its emotive force. This entails an obligation to create responsibly, to strive for authenticity and truthfulness in one's art, and to resist temptations to make kitschy art for quick, cheap effect. This calls for both aesthetic and moral integrity. An artist who achieved this fulfill a high calling, whether or not anyone recognizes this fact. For good artists not only beautify the world, but forge bonds of unity between people in ways that are felt more than rationally understood. Okay, conclusions. What may we glean from this discussion? I believe we can draw three main conclusions. In the handout, I've got two. I'm compressing the last two of these there. First, the concept of divine omnipathos is a hopeful compromise between the standard passibilist and impassibilist approaches to divine emotion. It incorporates the major insights of both views and avoids problems inherent in each. Omnipathism can be conceived in terms that parallel two classical attributes of God, divine omniscience and omnipresence, as we have seen. So it fits comfortably within an orthodox concept of God, while also affirming genuine divine relationality and emotive states. All of this has significant practical payoffs, as we've seen. Also, because of the concept of divine omnipathos, the divine art paradigm is applicable and fruitful given an expressivist view of art. On the face of things, this theory poses the greatest challenge to the divine art paradigm because of its implications that the work of the cosmic artist not only evokes emotions, but expresses them. Omnipathism provides a way to affirm this while preserving commitment to divine immutability and eternality. Finally, since the omnipathic view of God affirms the reality of divine emotion, it provides for a particularly rich concept of divine artistry as understood in terms of non-expressivist views of art, such as mimetic theory, formalism, and communication theory. The divine art paradigm is not only compatible with these major definitions of art, but also generates significant theological insights when applied to these definitions. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Spiegel. We are going to have a very brief Q&A section, so if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you.
I'm not very good at forming questions so fast, but it seems to me that emotions are a place where sin happens in our lives, and so some of the emotions I feel are skewed based on how God's emotions might be. So when you talked about God feeling how we feel and things like that, I didn't hear anything about that, the skewed thing about our sinful emotions and that kind of thing. And some of that probably has to do with which direction you're thinking, but I just would be interested in your comment on that.
Yeah. So like everything else about us, our emotions are tainted by the fall. And when we're thinking about divine emotion, of course we have to say God's perfectly holy in his emotion. Just like human truth claims are tainted by the fall. Just like, even our longing for beauty. You know, it's a good thing, but then that gets misdirected. That's tainted by the fall. So we have to be careful in terms of how far we go with saying, okay, this in God corresponds to this in me. But like so many other aspects of human life experience, we see it perfectly done by Jesus. And here is the man, the God-man, who demonstrates all sorts of emotions. Some of them are a bit kind of disturbing. You know? I mean, it's like, wow, he's pretty hard on those Pharisees, and there's name calling, and you know, he goes after them. There's exclamation marks there in the gospel materials. He's turning over money changers in the temple a couple of times. And you might say, wow, I wouldn't do that. You know? Well, if people were kind of setting up shop in your mom and dad's house, you might turn some things over once you arrive. So you have even strong emotions there, but they're all perfectly proportioned. to the situation. So even though we screw up with our emotions, it doesn't mean that we have to say all emotions are bad. Some go there, right? So some Christians and other mystics said even like sex is a necessary evil, right? And yes, Victorian times and other times and other cultures. Like, hold on here. I mean, there's illicit forms of sexual expression. But you're throwing out the baby with the bathwater there and calling it a necessary evil. So it's like everything else, but there is a lot to be said there. And that probably, as I continue working on that chapter, I mean, is a good reminder. I should carve out a section where I address that more explicitly, because that really is important.
I have an interesting but kind of simple question, but I was reading on Aquinas, and he said, he like formatted something like this. He said, laughter is like a reaction from someone who's surprised or unknowing of an event. So that's where laughter derives from. So, question to you, do you believe that Jesus ever like laughed on his time on earth?
It's a great question. I've thought about that. I don't know what the answer is, but I do know that there's some extra biblical accounts. You've got these non-canonical gospels, and even just reports and public records and things that have kind of survived through the ages regarding Jesus and things that they observed about him. One of them reports that about his physical features, the thing that's most outstanding, made the strongest impression was his eyes. This person says, when he looked at you, you felt like he was looking right through you. Of course, that is true. Very penetrating eyes, this person reports. And that person also reports that he never laughed and he rarely smiled. That's one person's report. But as I, consider the whole biblical portrait of Jesus and the gospel materials, that fits well from what I gather, particularly when you have the Bible itself referring to Jesus as, this is 700 years earlier, but in Isaiah 52, 53, it's referring to Jesus as a man of sorrows. Man of sorrows, right? His life was troubled. And not just in the Passion movie, but it was hard all the time for him. His station on earth was a sad one. I'm sure he had good times, and there was definite joy there. That's consistent with pain and suffering and being a man of sorrow. So that's all I can really say to that. But that is a great question. Particularly, since I can't remember that exact passage in Aquinas, but it might be sort of in the context where we associate laughter with surprise. Like somebody tells you a joke, and you're not expecting the punchline, right? It's like, oh, I didn't see that coming, then you laugh. And there are other ways, other contexts where we laugh with surprise, even if it's not in the context of a joke. There's something about the experience of surprise, if it's positive surprise, that will prompt laughter. And it's because it has to do with sort of certain emotions, intense positive emotion effervescing or bubbling up in us. Well, if you're omniscient, as Jesus being God incarnate is, well, you can't surprise him, And there, in fact, even be times where you could say something, and since his omniscience also entails exhaustive knowledge of the future, presumably you could prompt Jesus to remember the future by saying something. He's not even surprised about something yet to be. And I think that happens, you see it at least once, like when Peter says, well, everybody may deny you, all these other disciples may deny you, but I won't. Then, boom, Jesus remembers the future. Actually, Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows, right? So, could Jesus be surprised? There's another kind of related question. If not, and surprise is necessary for laughter, that would be another kind of argument that he doesn't laugh. But I don't know, that's also kind of speculative. That's a great question.
I really liked your talk. I was wondering if you'd be able to go over or elaborate on what the divine art paradigm was. I might have walked in late, so I might have missed something. But...
So I also call it the aesthetic interpretation of the world. And what prompted this initially for me a couple decades ago was reading, of all people, Friedrich Nietzsche. You know who Nietzsche is? Right? You ever read Nietzsche? So he's not especially friendly to theism, right? He's a very devout atheist. And yet he says about the world that he can only conceive it. It only makes sense to him if it's understood as an aesthetic phenomenon. By that, it means art. It's an artwork. Well, how do you have an art object without an artist? And when contemporary art theorists, whatever, talk about found art, that's an oxymoron at best, right? Oh, I found this rock. There's art. Well, the only way that works is if someone made it. And only those of us who are not just theists, but very robust theists can call a rock art. Well, we believe, since God created everything, in fact, everything is the artwork of God. So that's the aesthetic interpretation really that's the engine that's driving my book. If I take this seriously, and I look at the cosmos as the artwork of God, what does that imply about, you fill in the blank, right? How I understand history, how I understand science, how I understand families, my relationships, ethics. So I'm addressing all these things. That's the aesthetic interpretation of the world, also the divine art paradigm. If you think that's basically right, which if you're an Orthodox theist, Christian in particular, you don't even need to be a Christian, you can be any kind of strong theist, believer in God. If you think that's right, then you really need to take this seriously and start thinking about all aspects of your life as aspects of this divine artwork. We're dwelling in it. And then recognize, it's a very redemptive view too, because it implies that God is, if he's maximally beautiful and he's interested in beauty to the nth degree, that means he's going to make all things beautiful in the end. So it's a very promising, hopeful perspective.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spiegel. I've written so much down, my mind's going a lot of different places.
Good.
What a fun, big idea. I love stuff like this, and I'm only just hearing it, so I'm at the stage where I'm saying, yeah, what if? Divine omnipothism. What if? What a big idea, right? I think I like it.
Yeah, that's where I
questions. I guess the implications could go to scary places, maybe. Okay, here's where I'll go. If this is too much like Mrs. Trout's question, just say I already answered it and we'll call it a day. But my mind immediately went to the new heavens and the new earth, where we will know no sorrow. Will that still be part of God's omnipothism? You addressed that quickly, fair enough, but now my mind's going, after a question, my mind's going, okay, as humans, an emotion like regret. You mentioned regret. The text, the Bible tells us God regretted, right? As humans, we're used to thinking of that. That is a post-fall phenomenon to experience such a thing. Adam and Eve did not experience that as humans before the fall. If what you're presenting is true, we have to say that regret was part of God's existence, not just before the fall, but before creation itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, I can see, I'm not an impassibilist, but I can see that's where they would cry foul maybe.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know, is that a fair enough question to address?
No, that's good. I mean, that's a concern of mine. None of these three views is perfect. To my mind, this seems better than the other two options. You know, like, I'm a capitalist, right? I know it's got a lot of problems, but it's better than the alternative. But this would be a concern. Now, of course, if he has ever had the experience of regret, then it's always had it. But what you don't have in God is grounds to be morally regretful. Just as he doesn't have grounds to be repentant or sorrowful about his sin or whatever. But it is part of the imagination of God. It's called the eternal imagination of God. To have that, call it experiential awareness. It's a certain kind of awareness. It does not involve God in any sin or even limitation. Any more than his propositional knowledge of ugly, horrible things like rape and torture involve him negatively in that. So just think about what we already believe about divine omniscience. I mean, think about the horrors that have happened in this world and things that are too disturbing to mention in public. God has eternal awareness of that. So to say that he has an eternal kind of emotive awareness, I don't know if that's making the problem much worse. So it's a problem that's kind of, this is everybody's problem. I think, the divine omniscience about all sorts of sordid and despicable and disgusting things. Adding, if you want to put it that way, an emotive awareness, I don't think makes things much more problematic, if at all. Okay.
Thank you so much for your lecture. My question is kind of similar to Dr. Kikasola, so if it's too repetitive, just feel free to look past it. But if God is eternal and unchangeable, it stands to reason that before the inception of the cosmos, God exhibited emotions such as hate. Does this indicate that God is both eternally loving and infinitely hateful? Another thought, the epistemic nature of man is defined and limited to God's creative reality. Therefore, what does divine omnipathism look like outside of our creative reality? Or, if omnipathism is only present within created order, is God adaptive in nature or fixed?
All right, I'll deal with the first question first. It's tricky to even talk about before creation when you're talking about an eternal being that transcends time. I mean, one of the things that God did at creation is he made time and temporal ordering. So, yeah, I think here we're kind of dipping our toes, or maybe getting waist deep, into mysteries when we're talking about what was God doing, or what was his mental life like prior to creation. Having said that, say you have this, another way of dealing with this, what could be a disturbing concept in terms of eternal hatred in God, is to understand that in terms of what some philosophers call disposition states. And that means his nature is such that there are certain things that by his nature he would always hate. Okay? Mistreatment, or say slander of people, rape and torture, murder, idolatry. He hates these things, even in concept, before he created anyone who actually did those things. That is his eternal disposition, and there would at least be an imaginative awareness, even when these things did not actually exist. So this is another way of kind of cashing it out, is in terms of divine imagination. Right, so God hates, his disposition would be, his emotive awareness would be a hateful one towards all sin. And then an affection towards all goodness and virtue, anything that really reflects his own nature. And that's, the omnipathic view is that is, those are real emotions from all eternity. But he's never dominated by them. He never, you don't have to go the whole distance that most pacifists do and say that God eternally suffers. You don't have to go there to have this view, and I certainly would reject that. He doesn't, at least doesn't suffer in the way we ordinarily understand suffering, where I'm dominated by a negative feeling. And he can have that affect of emotional awareness without being dominated by it, or without it reducing his joy and eternal, infinite pleasure in the least. That's another thing that's worth reflecting on and continue thinking about.
All right. I think we're going to call the questions there, but feel free to hang around. There are refreshments outside the room. And let's thank Dr. Spiegel one more time.